Right now in the world, more children are aborted per year than humans die, like post-birth humans die. And
Whoa.
Trans woman to have a successful uterus transplant, ovaries and eggs included, and I want to be the first trans woman to have an abortion.
You mean I'll never know what it feels like to have a baby growing inside me and then scramble its brains and vacuum it out?
I realized that because it's a religious act for them almost.
I hope and pray to God my little fetus has a soul, 'cause I wanted to feel pain when I ejected from my home.
If you put a fetus in a human woman's body, it will eventually become a human being. But an egg and a sperm on their own, they won't eventually become a human being. And I was like, you just added a little word there. If you put them in a woman's body, if you put an egg and a sperm in a woman's body, just like if you put a fetus in a woman's body, it becomes a human being.
It is now standard medical practice after 15 weeks to use anesthesia during fetal surgeries. But, and this is really important, and this is going to come up a little bit later in my thoughts on this subject, pain medication is not standard practice in abortions. There's this one part of the medical establishment that is like, okay, this is a baby. We're going to save your baby. Don't worry, mother. It's going to be fine. And then there's this totally sort of other industry, which is like, this is a cluster of tissue. There's cardiac activity. You need to exercise your right. This is not human.
Would you like to know more?
Hello, Simone. I'm excited to be here with you today. Today, we're going to be doing an episode because this has been increasingly happening to me, where I have been updating my views on various subjects from back when I used to just be in the urban monoculture. You know, when you were growing up, you grew up in central San Francisco.
Oh, yeah.
And so you grew up really inundated with these far lefty ideas about everything. I grew up sort of all over the place, different, boarding schools and stuff like that. But a lot of them were in New England. And so I was heavily influenced by those cultures.
Right.
And when you're in the urban monoculture, this far progressive culture, you don't even really question things about abortion, right? It's just, you should always
bodily autonomy, women's right to choose, my body, my choice.
And I remember in high school when I, slept around a lot. I've mentioned this on other podcasts that, by the time I got to college, I slept with over 100 people, and I don't think that's a good thing to do. I would clarify. I think that I associated it with status. And then I began to, like the machine that Malcolm is. If I'm like, okay, this thing has value in society, I must orient my life around maximizing.
Right. If sex is your objective function, it's your objective function. You got to maximize it.
Well, and that's what the environment of this modern useful culture taught me, right? So I would try to engage with it as much as possible. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, like whenever the abortion stuff would come up, I won't be able to have sex as freely.
Yeah, as a man slut, abortion is very important.
Yes, fewer women will want to sleep with me, and they may get pregnant and then decide not to have an abortion. And then
I didn't even think about that. This election is screwed. All the men who want to have sex can't vote for
one of my favorite things is these progressives where you'll have them standing out and they'll be like, with these new abortion restrictions, I guess I'm not going to be able to sleep with any man whenever they feel like it. Like one woman you were talking about in a podcast was like, you know what? I'm seriously thinking about now only sleeping with men I'd be comfortable raising a child with. And it's like, you should have probably been, it was a societal mistake. And I can tell you, as a man who got full access to the sexual buffet that the progressives promised, though one of the core things that moved me away from all of that and that lifestyle is I was doing that. I had access to all the sex I wanted from anyone I wanted, whenever I wanted. And it didn't feel good. It felt good at the beginning because it wasn't really the sex that was the core thing that felt good. It
The
was
validation.
the validation, the
Yeah.
achieving something that was supposed to be hard and that gave me status within my community. But the sex itself just wasn't that important in terms of the happiness it gave me. And a lot of people are like, well, then that means you're not. No, you're lying to yourself, or you just haven't had a lot of sex. Like, I was very sexually experimental. I tried all the stuff. It was not. There's just not that much pleasure to be had there.
I mean, it's. I think it's very similar to food, in that it
Yeah.
can be very good, but also in the end.
So what I'm saying is, like, you're not really and this is the thing about traditions, and I mentioned this in another podcast recently, is that traditions we have as a society are not like the random opinions of old people. They are ideas that have been honed intergenerationally for thousands of years. Okay? When they came to me and they go, don't live a life just for sex. You know, you won't really enjoy it. You should focus on getting married and having a lot of kids. That's where fulfillment comes from. And I was like, old man, you don't know what's up. And now, like, I'm older, I have more experience, and I was like, oh, that was 100% correct. And I should note that I didn't get that from my parents. My parents actually told me, like, my mom was really like, yeah, you should go out and have sex with lots of people because that's a high status thing to do.
Oh, my parents too. Go out, experiment.
Oh yeah, they always were trying to push you to experiment, and you never did. You rebelled. But in updating my views on abortion, I've noticed a few things. So one thing I want to start talking about is the weird progressive worshiping of abortion.
Yes.
It's something I was sort of blind to. I saw it as a joke or like a radical thing, but
yeah. For example, in BoJack Horseman, the song, the abortion song by Aquafina.
Sextina Aquafina.
America, get your uteruses turned. I'm a baby killer. Baby killing makes me horny. Get that fetus, kill that fetus. Tall face bitches in my cross face. Have them know I'ma have abortions always. And sometimes I do. I hope and pray to God my little fetus has a soul. Cause I wanted to feel pain when I eject it from me.
Has the concept of women having choices gone too far?
But I've also seen it, like, there was a trans person trying to get a uterus transfer, and when asked why they wanted the uterus transfer, they wanted the uterus transfer to get an abortion. They wanted to get pregnant and then have an abortion.
Trans woman to have a successful uterus transplant, ovaries and eggs included, and I want to be the first trans woman to have an abortion.
And
right, get that fetus, kill that fetus, get that fetus, kill that fetus.
And it's like, whoa, like that what? You think that's okay? Like, why would you? And I realize that because it's a religious act for them almost. And when they talk about it, and you hear other progressives talking about it, that did you enter like this special club when you have an abortion that makes you more officially progressive? And this is wild because in South Park, you know, this is something Mr. Garrison wanted to do when he was getting his gender reassignment, and it was like a joke.
Mr. Garrison.
Mrs. Garrison.
You can't have an abortion.
Don't you tell me what I can and can't do with my body. A woman has a right to choose.
You can't get pregnant.
But I missed my period.
You can't have periods either.
You mean I'll never know what it feels like to have a baby growing inside me and then scramble its brains and vacuum it out? This would mean I'm not really a woman. I'm just a guy with a mutilated penis.
Basically, yes.
Oh boy, do I feel like a jackass.
And now it's like a mainstream thing in the progressive movement. And it's like, how did this become a mainstream thing? And I think similar to like, how did it become a mainstream thing for progressives to fight that the government should give pills that would only be relevant to people going to regular orgies with strangers? Like, why is that something the government needs to subsidize? Like, it is because it represents a me first attitude and they never have to deal with any mental consequences attitude. Like, we are, for example, not like if you're doing a very, and we'll get into like what we've actually come to after analyzing all the evidence and analyzing all the arguments on both sides. Like, I wouldn't be against an early abortion in regards to a person was raped or something like that. But like the person should still feel really bad about it and treat it as a weighty choice. The reason why, when I say feel bad about it, I mean, like, it's not like a small thing, okay, to do this. When progressives elevate it in this religious like way, I think the purpose of this is to remove any weight from the choice of abortion. And this has become so severe that I was looking at one statistic set, and right now in the world, more children are aborted per year than humans die, like post-birth humans die. And you gave you the statistic, you were like, this can't be true.
Yeah.
So in the United Nations, 61 million people died in 2023.
Okay.
Of these unintended pregnancy, so there are, sorry, how many unintended? There are roughly 121 million unintended pregnancies per year between 2015 and 2019. Of these unintended pregnancies, 61% ended in abortion. This translates to 73 million abortions per year. So there are around 73 million abortions per year, and around 61 million people die per year. So the lackadaisicalness with which it's treated by progressives is absolutely bananas to me. And let's also talk about the development of the fetus at this point as well. Actually, no, what I'll do is I'll structure this argument a few ways. So first, we need to ask the obvious sort of question in the room. Does life begin at conception? And we have a longer video where we talk about our views on this particular subject. My views on this have updated a little, but not much. I spent a lot more time studying and watching the Catholic views on this and the body. And I will play some clips from a video here that get the synthesis of like the most popular arguments they have.
I think for me, it all comes down to the nature of a thing. So how do you know what's the nature of a thing? Well, the nature of a thing is the what it isness of a thing, right? How do you discover, though, the nature of a thing is you have to look at the what is it forness of the thing, right? So what it isness is like, okay, that's the thing, that's the nature. How do you discover the nature? By looking at the what it's forness of the things. What is sex for? What's the nature of sex? Well, in order to understand the nature of sex, we have to find out the what it's forness of sex. So what is sex for? You'd realize it's for two things. It is for procreation and for the unity of the couple. And that's not me making something up. That's not me saying, well, that's the religious answer. It's just, that's the objective answer. That's what sex is for. That's the nature of sex.
And when I've talked to different Catholics, I keep getting the same basic argument. And the argument...
They've chosen their message. That's good. Consistency.
Well, yeah, I like it that it's consistent. I don't like it that it's a pagan argument. Well, it's based on Aristotelian ideas about what a thing is and not on the Bible. And I see why. If you actually go to the Bible is very clear. Life begins before conception. I knew you before you were in your mother's womb, you know. For those who are unaware of our view on where life begins, we believe that the Bible lays out pretty clearly that life begins before an individual is conceived, which means life begins with the decision or the potentiality of a decision to conceive a person. So every time you make a decision that prevents a future human from coming to exist, you have effectively killed that future human. Now, I wouldn't place our view of when life begins in law because it would be onerous for people of different belief systems, but I think that this is pretty obviously true. Whenever I make a decision that prevents somebody else from being alive, I may as well have killed that person. So, for example, if a woman was going to have 3 children by IVF, and I talk her out of having those 3 children, I have taken those 3 children's lives from them. Those are lives that would have come to exist had I not interfered. Therefore, I took those lives. But somebody would be like, well, haven't you taken, somebody's life from them if you had a inseminated egg that's frozen in an IVF lab? And it's like, no, because that's not a person that was ever going to be able to be born. If you, for example, from a woman take sperms and eggs and make 5,000 embryos, and you're like, well, all of those could be people. No, they couldn't, because you need 5,000 humans to gestate them and everything like that. In the same way that I don't think that somebody, because, you need a sperm and an egg put in a woman in the same way you need an embryo put in a woman to grow to eventually become a person. I don't think a person who has masturbated has literally killed millions of people, because there is no way that every single one of those sperm was going to inseminate a separate egg and eventually become an adult human. However, if a person was going to sleep with someone and that person was going to get pregnant that night, but instead they decide to masturbate, in that case, yes, the person has taken another person's life from them, somebody who would have gotten to live that life. But if I take one woman who was planning to have kids and I talk her out of it, yeah, I have taken those children's lives from them, just as much as I look at my children who are all made with IVF. And I know that if somebody had prevented me from having these children, those are lives that wouldn't get to exist. And these are not lives that are any lesser than other lives. And this is what we believe. We believe in predestination, and God definitely knows you before conception. And that if I'm really looking for the point of the beginning of an individual human's life, it's with their gametes. But they're not even really. I think
it's with their actions and decisions. It's with their.
Yeah, but we can talk about that in different ways. But the basic logic that they use is sex as an act is for making children, and so using sex for something else is sinful. So that's one argument about like sex for any other reason, or
that's not supported in the Bible.
That's not supported in the Bible, by the way.
Yeah, Song of Solomon, for example, supports non-procreative sex within marriage. There's no prohibition in the Bible against infertile couples who are married having sex. The emphasis in the Bible, and this is very clear, is that sex within marriage is permitted, but it doesn't need to be procreative. The elements where suddenly non-procreative sex is considered not okay, that was completely formulated by the church later. It is not biblically based.
Absolutely. Yeah. So to me, this argument of like sex is for creating humans, therefore that's the only way you should be creating humans, is sort of like legs are for walking, therefore cars are a sin. Or eyes are for seeing, therefore glasses are a sin. Like just the logical structure of this argument is genuinely bizarre to me. And then they'll say things like, in the video, he has this one line where he's like, well, I mean, a human life just begins when a fetus is created.
We believe that life begins at conception, because it does. Again, this isn't like a religious thing. This is life begins at conception because it does. Sex is for procreation and unity because it is, right?
And I'm like, but why? And I love you in the car this morning. You turn to me and you go, well, there is a level of logical consistency to this point. You said, you see, if you put a fetus in a human woman's body, it will eventually become a human being. And then you're like, yeah, but an egg and a sperm on their own, they won't eventually become a human being. And I was like, you just added a little word there that made those two things a false equivalency and allowed your little logical trick to work. You added if you put them in a woman's body. If you put an egg and a sperm in a woman's body, just like if you put a fetus in a woman's body, it becomes a human being. Okay?
Yeah, or at least has the potential. Because again, even an embryo that naturally was fertilized within a woman's fallopian tubes or uterus may not implant or may miscarry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and so they're just ignoring that. But also I think about like the concept of ensoulment. So if you believe in a soul, like what is that soul binding to? Like if I cut off my finger, have I lost part of my soul? Like it does not seem to me that by any logical assumption, when you're talking about ensoulment, that the soul is binding to just human tissue. It's binding.
Yeah, but that's no one ever has made that argument. The way I've tried to explain it to you.
They are arguing that the human soul is binding to the developing fetus before it has any neural tissue.
As soon as it is something that is distinct as the thing it will become. And I was trying to tell you, like, I think it's akin to having a shadow. Once you can cast a shadow, you're not going to lose your shadow if you lose a finger. There's no part of your body that your shadow is connected to.
No, you have lost. This is the point. I actually think that this is really important. You have lost part of your shadow if you lose a finger. So what is the thing that must remain intact for your personality, your objectives, your everything like that to maintain and be intact. It's your nervous system. You need a nervous system for ensoulment to happen. I just cannot see an argument that that my finger, for example, if kept alive for part of me, like is keeping a part of my soul somewhere else. Like if I cut off my finger and then I put my finger in like a lab and it's like a growing separate from me, has like my soul separated into two? Like obviously not. However, what frequently happens after conception is the creation of human identical twins, where a single embryo splits later in the developmental process, but always before the nervous system has begun to develop. Do I believe that the soul split? No, it's just that ensoulment hadn't happened yet. So this then becomes super important when the nervous system develops to me. But I also want to go further with this human embryo splitting thing. So chimeras and identical twins, to me, are the strongest argument against the belief that ensoulment happens at conception. And here, a bit of history for people who don't know, this is not a traditional Catholic belief. If you talk about when Catholicism was in its golden age, its greatest philosophers like Thomas Aquinas and Augustus of Hippo believed that life began at ensoulment, so about 60 to 80 days after conception, which is interesting. The ideas that Catholics use to talk about you need the essence of a thing, when does that start, came from Aristotle, but even Aristotle thought that life began 60 to 80 days after conception. All of this is a very modern Catholic theology that was laid down by Pope Pius IX. If you're wondering which pope this is the guy who did the gay castration, ripping penises off of all the statues. This is the guy
they were too small, Malcolm. It was insulting.
Yeah, the guy who did the syllabus of errors. This is the Catholic text that said that Catholics should try to form a caliphate or a Catholic government system whenever they can. This is, to me, sort of the epitome of the Catholic Dark Age mindset of, we need to erase the people who were culturally above us, like these classical creators and everything like that, because we can't even appreciate their art anymore. We can't even, draw fig leaves on everything, so that was the guy who came up with this. But if we're talking chimeras and identical twins, because this to me is by far the strongest point. Like, God controls how human biology works. The fact that he lets embryos split into identical twins and human chimeras to exist. So what a human chimera is sometimes you'll get twins. So a human will become impregnated with twins.
Fraternal twins.
Yeah, fraternal twins, and then these two twins merge always before the nervous system is beginning to develop into a single entity, and this entity then develops believing it is genetically one person, but it's actually genetically two people. And the rate of chimeras differs really heavily between different animals. So if you look at something like marmosets, over 50% of marmosets are actually chimeras.
No way. That's so cool.
It is not a biological necessity that human chimeras were viable.
Wow.
God made that biological thing happen. So then do you think that God is regularly killing just random growing fetuses for no reason when he didn't have to? Or do you think that he waits? Also, if you look at when the body naturally aborts a growing, because a huge number of pregnancies are naturally aborted. What percentage is it? It's like 20%, but it almost always happens before the nervous system starts developing.
Yeah, quite early.
God created a system that allows our bodies to quickly determine the quality of life that will be had by a certain genetic strain and end it before it becomes a human. And he signaled this to us very loudly by the creation of chimeras, by identical twins, and by literally writing it in the Bible. Like I don't understand how you can just ignore what's written in the Bible so loudly, because pagan philosophers told you this alternate ethical theory. But then, and I want to be as nice as I can when I say this, but from our perspective, whenever I look at my kids, and now this is why I take abortion so much more seriously than I did historically.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, you aren't, and I hate this saying of you're killing a baby. You're not killing a baby. You're killing a human being who's going to live their entire life, who's going to have dreams and goals. When you tell somebody,
well, it's a baby and it's a child and it's an adolescent and it's an adult, a parent, a grandparent, a worker, a leader, someone who's going to love people and be loved.
Yeah, recently I went to a reunion and I was around all of my nephews and nieces and everything like that. And it really just hit home for me every kid I don't have is somebody who's not going to get to be a teenager, is somebody who's not going to get to have a first love, who's not going to get to have a job. Every time you talk somebody out of IVF for reasons that don't have any biblical backing, you are removing a human being from the opportunity to live.
Well, and just to restate what you're talking about, the sort of realization that you and I both had, is that we saw people that we had hung out with when they were just little kids, low agency people, not super terribly interesting, whatever, right? You're not going to have complex conversations with them. And then in what felt like the blink of an eye, here we are talking with them as adults and realizing, oh, holy crap, you're a real person. And when a lot of people are thinking, should I have kids? Should I have a baby? They're literally saying, and I think the wording is part of what influences people's incorrect thinking or incomplete thinking, is they're thinking literally, should I have a baby? They're thinking of
what they should be asking is, should I be denying a human the right to exist?
Yeah, they're not thinking of an adult with the full range of feelings and the complex life of an adult. They're thinking about a small, low agency human.
Well, and also let's just talk about like the logical insanity of this, right? Like, if you take this mindset, what you're saying is that if a sperm is about to reach an egg and I put down like a metal sheet between them, the moment before it happened and it doesn't reach the egg, I have done something of not particularly bad action. But if like a fraction of a second after it hits that egg, I end up quashing that egg, now I have killed a human being.
By Catholic definitions, not by our definitions.
No, not by our definitions. But to me, this just seems like splitting hairs. It seems like any decision you make that prevents a human being from existing is functionally killing a human. And so from our perspective, and this is another thing that really gets me, the Catholic celibacy of the priest caste, that it is a religion that is ruled by people who have sacrificed their children's lives for a chance at power. That is what, as soon as I realize, like when I don't have a kid, I am sacrificing a human life. To think that you sacrificed all of your children's life, not like your firstborn, all of your children's life at a shot of power, that's obviously going to twist your thinking around the value of a human life. And you're going to need to come up with these weird deontological frameworks to not face the horror of the decision that you yourself have made. So I can understand why they need to take this framework, because that's a big thing. The Bible does not say that the priest caste needs to be celibate. It has like one line where it is like celibacy is okay for like some holy people, or it might have like two lines in regards to this. But, you know, it also has lines to the contrary. So you can look at something like Corinthians 7:2 that doesn't just explain that, you know, you should get married, but why you should, which is to say, but because the temptation of sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. Now, what is this saying? It's saying if you build a society or an organization where you don't give men a wife, what's going to happen is extreme forms of sexual immorality, for example, child grape, which, you know, prescient.
You know,
not 100% against it, but it is be fruitful and multiply. Like this is like a recurring thing throughout the Bible. You're supposed to have kids. And so again, it's like tradition is overriding what is biblical. But now I need to go over.
Well, no. It's, I just want to dive into this a little bit more, because what it seems like the Bible really pushes for is self-discipline. Self-discipline in your desires and self-discipline in your action. So it's not the actual absence of having sex that matters. And it's not whether or not you're a virgin. It's, are you able to abstain? Are you able to prioritize God over your personal comfort? And of course, chastity is supported when not being chaste involves, for example, breaking your marriage contract and cheating on your spouse. That's not okay. That's clear. And also lusting after someone else's wife is bad, but that really has to do with emotional control and doesn't have to do with what you're actually, like how slutty or not slutty you are. This is about, are you prioritizing God and are you in control of your human functions? And I think for the same reason why gluttony is not okay, but eating is okay. It's really about how you do it, and it's about moderation. I just want to make that clear, because when I actually looked at what the Bible says, I was surprised by how little technical not having sex was emphasized.
Yeah, so it's like, and this is the thing that gets me, the cost of this. If it was just that they were exercising self-discipline, instead of denying humans who otherwise would have been born the right to exist, I wouldn't care about it. If they weren't convincing other people, especially when you consider that by 2060, 50% of the population is going to be infertile, especially when you consider that Catholics get married much later than other Christian denominations, which is the core reason why they're lower fertility than once they're married, they have kids at the same rate. Sorry, we should note this. Catholics are way lower fertility than other Christian groups. You can see our video on this. So I'm like genuinely afraid for like Catholic survival in one sense, and then in another sense, because I'm looking at this from a different moral framework, the Bible, instead of like all of this tradition and everything. Obviously, I'm going to see things a little differently, but to me, it looks like, child sacrifice. But I want to go further here to talk about what progressives think and just how crazy it is. If you look at the way that progressives are being coached to talk about fetus, they will do things like be coached to talk about cardiac activity instead of a heartbeat.
Yeah, or what did they say? Cluster of cells? Is that how they put it? I'm trying to remember.
Or cardiac tissue begins to pulse, This happens at 5 to 6 weeks.
I think about my child's heartbeat. It makes me weak.
But I want to go over the timeline of a pregnancy so we can sort of come to when does it seem like there is enough neural tissue there for ensoulment to happen?
Yeah.
And I like your idea of the shadow cast. When is a shadow beginning to be cast by this thing that will eventually become a person?
Okay.
And again, I don't think that non-neural tissue casts a shadow in humans. And so I think that you're going to have to, my finger does not cast a shadow that a soul could inhabit, from my body.
So let's go over the timing. And I want to start with something that's really important that kind of threw me for a loop when I first started having pregnancies. Pregnancy weeks are not intuitive. Okay. Pregnancy weeks, like I'm 20 weeks pregnant, I am 5 weeks pregnant, is conception minus 2 weeks. Pregnancy week starts with the female cycle starting. So when I start my period is when day 1 of the pregnancy 40 weeks period starts. Did you know that, Malcolm?
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So now basically, if we're talking the Catholic concept, a woman who's 2 weeks pregnant actually isn't pregnant because no conception has happened. She's in the process of preparing to ovulate. So also keep in mind that implantation after conception, so once the egg and sperm are fertilized, which typically occurs about 2 weeks after your last period begins, implantation into the uterine lining doesn't happen for another 8 or 9 days. And I know this all too well from IVF. I've had a cycle where, things didn't go quite well and I lost our embryo. Implantation doesn't always go well. It is not a guarantee that after there is conception and you have a fertilized embryo that has made it to day 5, that is going all right, is going to implant properly and continue to start growing. So like you say, that the body has many ways of being like, oh, it's not working out. Go ahead.
Do you want me to go into like the timeline?
Sure.
So if you go to around 3 to 4 weeks, that's when the neural tube begins to form. Now, what's very important, and people can misunderstand this if they haven't studied developmental biology, is the neural tube is not made of neural tissue. It is not neurons. It is just a tube of cells that eventually turns into all of the stuff that is a neuron and a brain and everything like that. But it is not, there's not like action potentials and stuff like that in the neural tube. By week 6 or 7, the first neurons begin to form and a basic brain structure begins to develop. So this is when I think 6 and 7, like if you are at the absolute earliest of when ensoulment can happen, that's I think the absolute earliest of when
7
ensoulment
weeks
might happen.
Which would be 5 weeks. So a month and 1 week after the sex act will have happened, which is important just from a logistical standpoint.
Okay. No. This isn't looking at the weeks of pregnancy. This is looking at
8 weeks of gestation.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. The weeks that I'm looking at are based on pregnancy weeks because that is how all of these things work. And 7 weeks is when, based on 7 weeks of pregnancy is when the pain receptors start to form, is when the nervous system starts to form. So
Well, so that's when the pain receptors start to form, but you don't have brain waves yet, which is important.
yes, you don't have brain waves yet. Yeah, so although at 8 weeks, fetuses can move in response to stimuli. That's when things get even more like things start to snowball.
8 to 10 weeks is when you get brain waves and they can move in response to stimuli.
Uh-huh.
I think for me, this is when I'd say you likely have a human being there.
Well, I would say
But
even
very
more so.
shadowy human being. It would be like a not fully binded soul yet from my perspective.
Yeah, we're getting, it's getting into dark territory. Then at 12 weeks, the nerves linking pain receptors to the thalamus and subcortical plate start forming. And that's when researchers really start to argue that fetuses can feel pain. And
when I think they obviously can. So there's been things where people have done like videos of like abortions and you can see like the fetus screaming.
Like, don't tell me. Don't.
So they
Now I'm gonna cry all night. Jesus.
If you're going in these later stages. So I think
you didn't give me a trigger warning. I should have known. We're talking about this.
The 12-week mark, I think is where it really I don't understand how you can go past that.
Yeah. Well, and here's the thing that really gets me is that at 15 weeks, if, for example, that you have some really rare condition and some kind of procedure needs to be done on your fetus, that at that point they start using pain medication on your fetus to save it. But like when they're doing the thing, it is now standard medical practice after 15 weeks to use anesthesia during fetal surgeries.
Now let's talk about
this is really important, and this is going to come up a little bit later in my thoughts on this subject. Pain medication is not standard practice in abortions. Regardless.
Oh, that's wild. It's standard practice when they're trying to save the baby.
They're trying to save it. It's standard practice after 15 weeks. Of course, use anesthesia. Abortions, that a doctor may at their discretion, but there is no standard practice because that's what's so interesting to this about me is there's this one part of the medical establishment that is like, okay, this is a baby. We're going to save your baby. Don't worry, mother. It's going to be fine. And then there's this totally sort of other industry, which is like, this is a cluster of tissue. There's cardiac activity. You need to exercise your right. This is not human. And I think, when we're talking about something that is capable of feeling pain, that is recoiling in response to stimuli, to sharp stimuli or cuts, and I'm just going to get into it. So I think that at some points abortions are appropriate. But I also think that throughout any point in someone's life, euthanasia is sometimes appropriate. And that is when you have a life-threatening, you have days to live, and you either get to choose between, 3 weeks, 5 days, whatever, of intense suffering and pain, or you can, choose to terminate your life, or if someone doesn't have agency, out of love for them, terminate their life in as kind and painless as a fashion possible. And so I think that that's really the discussion that should be had in the instance of abortions, is that when a child is not viable and is going to die in intense pain, you need to take the same approach that you would take with any human in palliative care.
I'd actually like you to push this when you're in office. I think a bill that one rolls back how late abortion is happening in Pennsylvania, but two mandates that when it does happen after a certain date that they use anesthetics.
Yeah. So in Utah,
then it forces them to consider but
in Utah and some other states, and of course Utah, because they get it, they love their kids. They do have some rules about using anesthesia that require you to use anesthesia for abortions, but this is not universal in state. So there are some legal requirements on this front, but it is not. Let's see, in Utah, I'm trying to. Oh no, I don't have how many weeks it is in Utah, but I think it might even be 20 weeks. I think it might be after 20 weeks in Utah. And what I would say is after 12 weeks, period, you're using pain meds on this.
Republicans here are like, oh, you guys are being rhinos about this stuff. If you look at Republicans by Pew data who are under the age of 30, like the next generation of Republicans are around 47%, so around half believe in abortions under any circumstance. The standard Republican establishment in the United States has screwed up the United States abortion practice to the extent. So let me explain what I mean by that. In Pennsylvania right now, it's legal to get abortions up to 24 weeks. This is true in most US states. Now, people don't understand why.
Yeah, and I think in Pennsylvania it's 23, isn't it?
It's 24.
It's 24. Oh, God.
Nope. Simone was right as always. It is 23 in a few days. Oh, so hold on. Now, what's really important here, right, is a lot of people were like, we're okay with like the European model of 12 weeks, right? Like that's what it is in most.
I think it's 15 in most
12
areas.
to 15, yeah, depending, 15 weeks. So people are like, why do you guys keep pointing out that it's 15 weeks in Europe? And the reason why we keep pointing that out is America is a more conservative country than Europe.
Yes.
So hold on. So why is it true that in America we have much looser abortion policy than they have in Europe? The answer is the life begins at conception crowd.
Did that pick up on the mic?
No.
Oh, okay.
But the answer is the reason why we have such a late and horrific abortion policy in the US is the life begins at conception crowd. They absolutely screwed up this fight and kept us from winning and passing sane legislation around abortion because they always were like, well, I won't vote for this. I won't vote for them.
Yeah, so there can be no reasonable compromise, no reasonable legislation because it's so polarized now.
They have and they have created this mindset where people don't even engage with what's really happening. Even young Republicans don't really engage with what's really happening. If you look at our views on abortion, we should move it back to this 12-week mark. This view on abortion is far to the right of the average Republican voter in America right now.
Yeah. Well, and here's another thing that I really want to emphasize. 12 weeks is 3 months, is a summer vacation in the United States. 3 months. Think about how much can happen in 3 months. You can do a world tour in 3 months. You can do a European tour in 3 months. You can grow a beard in 3 months. You can, significantly adjust to life trauma in 3 months. That is enough time if you just decide you don't want a baby to take care of it in 3 months. I mean, honestly, after you have had sex with someone, you can immediately take a morning after pill, assuming that you're in a state where that's legal.
And if here you think we're being anti-Catholic or something and saying that the morning after pill should be legal, consider that in the United States, non-religiously affiliated individuals who have never been married, 35% have used the morning after pill. Among Catholics, that's 32%. That's much higher than groups like evangelical Protestants, where it's only 28%, and they don't even have a religious objection to that. Or you can say, well, okay, that's just the non-super religious Catholics, right? The very religious Catholics, the number must be significantly different. Well, unfortunately, if you go to the ones who go to church once a month, it's 36%. 1 to 3 times a month, it's 33%. And then weekly, it's 25%. So still a quarter of Catholics who go to church every week have used the morning after pill. And if you're like, well, then this just proves we need to remove the temptation to sin, except then you don't get much more Catholic than the First Council of Nicaea. And at the First Council of Nicaea, it was decided it was so sinful to remove the temptation of sin from an individual that those individuals weren't allowed in the priesthood. Specifically, individuals who had castrated themselves to make it easier to not be tempted by sexual sin were forcibly removed from the priesthood. Sin exists to fortify your spirit through resisting. If God didn't want the devil to tempt you, if God didn't want the devil to be doing what he's doing, he could snap his fingers and the devil would disappear.
And I think, things like this should be legal. I mean, we don't want to get to a point where, this is a problem in the first place, where people are destroying life and it gets worse. This is one of those things where it starts off, the morality of it gets worse and worse the longer you wait. And I think it would be so great if we just moved the timeline up a little bit so that the damage that people did, and people took it seriously instead of just waiting and waiting and waiting.
But hold on, we need to keep going here because I want to, with this 24-week in mind, so you guys understand why this is worth fighting for. Because I think a lot of people, they either get this idiotic life begins at conception perspective, which is anti-biblical, it's pagan, okay? It is not what the great Catholic thinkers thought. It is a modern mindset. And if people are like, oh, Protestants did not think this is
and ultimately leads to more abortions, to the point you just made.
Yeah,
more abortions are taking place because you're holding this view.
In the 1970s, more Republicans than Democrats were pro-abortion, but they wanted more strict access to abortion. And this whole thing fell apart when we entered this recreational abortion era. And then this worshiping of abortion that we now get with Democrats because of this alternate mindset. But what I want to go into now is what is actually happening. So we got to the 12-week mark where we're like, okay, I can no longer justify, what is happening from there to the 24-week mark. Okay.
Trigger warnings for your wife who cries all night
16
thinking about
18, the cerebral cortex starts to form layers. Auditory development begins and the fetus may start to hear sound. And then by week 20, the thalamus and cortex begin to form connections, which is considered crucial for consciousness. So they're almost certainly conscious at this point. 23 to 20.
And consciousness is one of those things that also makes us human. So if we're talking about, well, I'm okay with killing animals, I eat meat, why would I not be okay with killing, a human? The thing that makes a thing that isn't quite human, a thing that makes us human is consciousness. So I think to that point, it's getting worse.
23 to 26, rapid brain growth occurs. Some studies suggest that rudimentary forms of consciousness might begin to emerge around this time. And so that's the stage that right now they're like, okay, yeah, we can go a little bit past that stage. And that is, and by the way, before that stage, you were giving me the studies on things like being able to react when the mother is eating certain types of food. And stuff.
They make yucky faces when mothers are fed bitter foods. Even when the mother cannot taste them. That's what's so cool about these is that for the research, they put a tube down the mother's throat. So the mother's not tasting the food. They're not reacting to like stress hormones in the mother's body. They're literally reacting to the food that they're getting through their placenta.
Yeah, and here I'd note all of this in the context. When people talk about the life begins at conception and in terms of like not doing IVF, they'll do this thing where they'll be like, well, humans born through IVF aren't lesser than other humans.
Now, say you have we did in vitro, and now we have a child. Are you saying that they shouldn't be here? Are you saying that they're not really human? They're not made in God's image and likeness? I am absolutely not saying that. If you have been conceived through in vitro, or your children have been conceived through in vitro, you are a child of God. You're made in God's image and likeness. They are made in God's image and likeness. That's the truth. You're loved by God, not an accident, not a mistake.
Like they'll then add that, and it's like, but you're saying that they are. You're saying that if people had listened to you, if they have chosen the timeline that you are advocating for, those actual children wouldn't exist. And when I look at my children...
Oh, but that's not how they see it. How they see it is that millions of unborn children are locked up in freezers right now. Their souls stuck forever, soon to be discarded because of IVF.
But they're literally preventing some souls from coming to exist. Like they can even if you believe that, despite the fact that that's pagan and goes against the Bible, despite the fact that like God created, like, do you think that God's an idiot that he made human chimeras as like a joke? Like just erasing infant souls?
I could see
reason?
Listen, I mean, God lets infants die sometimes. He could just be like, you know what, this soul's joining me.
We'll just get rid of this one. Yeah. No, but the callousness with which that means God is treating these souls. If you look at the number of implanted fetus embryos that don't end up developing into fetuses, does God, was he just acting incredibly callously with these souls? This is the thing to me. So, okay, even if you believe this, then you are still preventing some souls that otherwise would have come to grow and live full adult lives from living full adult lives. You are still preventing those humans from coming into existence. And I just can't get over it. When I look at my kids, these are people who they would have denied existence. And I just can't get over. And what are you doing when you deny someone existence other than killing them? And again, this is just something that resonates with me so strongly. And I feel so strongly about now when I think about every time when somebody, because one of my cousins pulled me aside recently and she goes, well, you have 4 kids. Like, think about the vacations they won't get to experience because of the other kids. I'm like, those are additional human beings you're talking about. Like, those are additional people who are going to be here at these events. And this is all so uniquely important for Catholics because of the late Catholic marriage rate. People can be like, why is this so uniquely important if you have a late Catholic marriage rate? Well, because it turns out that the health of an embryo, genetically speaking, and in terms of life outcomes, is based not on when the mother got pregnant, but when the embryo was frozen. So if a Catholic gets married at like 30 and they freeze a bunch of embryos and they keep having kids until like their 50s, those kids will be as healthy as they would have been had they had them in their 30s. So they are increasing those children's quality of lives and helping the Catholic tradition survive. And that scares me as well. It's the death of the Catholic tradition. But right now, if you look at current Catholic fertility rates, and right now Catholics in the United States have a lower fertility rate than the secular population of the United States. Or not the secular, but I'd say the average population of the United States. Not if you split out seculars, but the average population, which includes the secular population, and it shouldn't even be close. Like, this is banana nutter butters. Sorry, I should clarify here. I mean the native-born Catholic fertility rate. Immigrants typically have a slightly higher fertility rate than native-born individuals, and when you include the large Catholic immigrant population in the United States, it goes above the average. And people are like, well, you've got the conservative communities, and maybe they'll pull through, but I am scared, okay, that they won't. And we talked about this in the other Catholic fertility before we updated our own views, because the one thing I really want to take this video as an opportunity to do is for people who like are just so focused on the life begins at conception thing that they don't focus on when the fetus begins developing a nervous system. They don't focus on just how casually abortions are being done globally now with the global export of abortions.
Well, and also with the lack of any ability to compromise the fact that some really egregious things are happening. And if everyone could just be reasonable and we could just agree, you know, whether or not you believe in ensoulment, I think we can all agree that euthanizing a human without any painkillers is pretty freaking horrendous. And that, you know, once someone is able to recoil in pain, maybe we should ask for their permission before we do something that causes them pain, that kind of thing, you know, or, you know, at least give them a shot. Give them some.
Yeah, and if some people are like, well, human dignity is scaled with human intelligence, right? So they're like, they begin to get like gradually more of a soul the smarter they get. You get a big problem there because that means then that you think that like the mentally disabled have less of a soul. Mm-hmm. And I understand the logic in this, right? Like, I think it's an internally consistent perspective. Yeah. I think it's much more internally consistent than life begins at conception. I do not think that is an internally consistent perspective because it requires the trick of the tongue where life begins at conception because the fetus becomes a human when you put it in a woman, but an egg and a sperm will not become a human. And it's like, you've left out the second part. You can't do that. If you put them in a woman, they do become a human and therefore they do matter. Which sorry, that really gets me that they always leave out the second part. It's a completely logically inconsistent argument. Every sperm is sacred. Or the idea that, and I just don't get theology of the body. And maybe somebody can explain this to me. Maybe there's something I'm missing in the comments where you guys can be like, it's not exactly that sex is for creating embryos and therefore that means that. Okay, so sex is for creating babies. Therefore, if you create babies in any other way, it's wrong. Or if you use sex for anything else, it's wrong.
No, because you can use things biblically. You can use sex for other things, for enjoyment.
Yeah, and also like legs are for walking, therefore swimming is a sin. Like, no. What? That makes no sense. Therefore, or it's like, okay, swimming didn't exist. Therefore, bicycling is a sin because bicycling didn't exist during the Bible. So bicycling must be a sin. We're using technology so that our legs can do something that they were not created to do. And it's like, that's silly. It's like, I don't mean to like dismiss the argument here, but I'd love to hear an argument that like just doesn't come across as silly. If the alternative, now keep in mind, they're often like, well, I just want to be safe on this issue. And it's like, yeah, but you're killing kids because those kids would have come to exist otherwise. And you talked people out of having them. So it's not like there's no moral weight to this. This is an incredibly important decision, especially in the context of 50% of men in the developed world being infertile by 2060. Any final thoughts, Simone? Because you are always more tempered than me. You always have more sophisticated ideas than me.
No, it just confuses me.
Do you find the argument compelling at all? Like, if you
the Catholic argument against sex for pleasure?
Yeah.
No, this was developed by the Council of Trent in 1546. I don't know how people thought then. Who knows what was going on then? Who knows who these people were? So,
I mean, we know literally who they were, but they weren't like biblically like inspired by God or anything.
Well,
They're, like,
right, but like what I'm
council.
saying is, well, what if they were, you know, at that time there was like a really big gay orgy problem among the people who were there, who were like, you know what, this sex for pleasure thing, not great. Let's just make it clear that sex should only be for
I should note
procreation.
that
I don't know,
our
like
view-
we weren't there.
This is actually going to come out in a future tract, but I actually do believe that sex within marriage that is no chance of leading to a kid is a form of sin. And a person might be like, yeah, but God allowed it in certain parts of the Bible. And I'd say, well, the deontological rule set that God laid out in the Bible changes over time, which to us is evidence that God actually meant for a consequentialist outcome. You know, like, do I think God is pro-slavery because he gave rules for how slavery should work?
Okay, but
no.
If that's true, then I would also argue that drinking alcohol is a sin unless you're drinking it for frontier medicine purposes.
I agree drinking alcohol is a sin.
And that eating non-nutritious food or eating when you don't have a caloric need is
I agree
equally...
that eating when you don't have a caloric need. Anything that you can't do for the glory of God, the Bible makes this clear in multiple occasions, is a sin.
Yeah. But so that means it's also kind of one of those things that we're all breaking the rule, so who cares?
Well, no, it's not. We're all breaking the rule, so who cares? It's just don't glorify the sin. Be aware that we are wretched, we are fallen, we are.
Yeah. Don't expect a prize, kid. That kind of thing.
Don't expect a prize. Like, you can say, okay, I was doing something that wasn't glorifying God, but again, I'm not a God myself. I'm not Jesus. Like, I'm not sinless. The important thing to bite the bullet on is just to not glorify the sin, to not attempt to worship God through the act of sex or something like that, to not treat sex as a sacrament to God just because you're doing it in a marriage if you know it's non-reproductive. And so, yeah, that's the way I feel, and that's much more controversial for me to say that. And you know, I do think that we
to
need
say
to
that drinking and eating non-nutritious food is a sin. That's pretty standard. It seems reasonable.
Not standard. Oh no, not in modern Christianity.
Reasonable.
I think modern Christianity has gotten to this state where it's like some things are sins, some things are like.
I guess maybe it seems reasonable to me because that it's more something that you kind of get the feeling of in the rationalist or EA community that gluten is a sin. You know, eating sugar is a sin. Eating cake is a sin. Or you even get it on like internet culture. I mean, like intermittent fasting is a sin.
I think, for example, sports are a sin. Like watching sports for entertainment are a sin. But
yeah, you're taking a very puritanical approach. They talk about in
no, I'm taking a biblical approach here, Simone. The Bible says if you can't do it for the glory of God, it's a sin. Okay, you know, I can go through a few quotes here in post. So here you have lines like Corinthians 10:31, which instructs us, whether therefore you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all for the glory of God. Or Corinthians 5:15, which states, and he died for all, that those who live should no longer live for themselves, but for him who died and then was raised again. Or Galatians 3:23, which states, and whatever ye do, do it heartily as to the Lord and not unto men. Or Romans 14:23, which states, but if you have doubts about whether or not you should eat something, you are sinning if you go ahead and do it, for you are not following your convictions. If you do anything you believe is not right, you are sinning. But no, it is a sin. The people of the past lived with easier to follow ethical systems than are demanded of us because we have developed past what God expected of those earlier generations. And, you know, if you're not doing it for the glory of God, then it is a sin. And I think, you know, yeah, I don't like this weaselly, like, oh, well, it's not a sin because it doesn't, you know, cause disgust in me. You know, it's like, well, actually, you know, look towards what the Bible is saying and come up with like a logical way to interpret it that doesn't.
Well, yeah, that's what's so clear about sex in the Bible is that it really is, you know, not about whether you're doing it or not.
But I will say I have a grayer area on sex within marriage. I am not 100% sure if that has to be a sin, because the Bible does say it's okay for non-procreative purposes. So I'm
Song
like,
of Solomon, my friend. It is.
yeah, this might be the
It doesn't.
one.
I think if you want to take a purely biblical approach, you're going to have to come down exactly where the Puritans came down, where sex within marriage, even if it's not procreative, is freaking fantastic.
Okay, sex within marriage is fine. I will break on that. But again, I don't think that okay, it's fine. Sex within marriage, because it can be done for the glory of God, is fine. I have thought about this further, and I was wrong on this point. I think we need to view the lines in the Bible that approve of sex within marriage that is non-procreative as fine, as being equivalent to the lines in the Bible that give rules around slavery. The reason being that, can you do an act which is primarily for your own pleasure for the glory of God? And the answer here is just no. An act devoid of industry cannot be for the glory of God. We are held to different moral standards than our ancestors were by God. And we can choose to either live like people who lived 2,000 years ago, or we can choose to step up to this stricter set of moral requirements that's, I believe, demanded of us.
Well, I think what we're looking at is the celebration of a sacrament, an alignment and unity of man and woman, which is something that God is cool with. He made the Barbie and Ken doll because he wants to see them kiss.
Yeah, I see that. And I will also note here, when people are like, no, the council of whatever, like, this is approved by God, because everything done within the church bureaucracy is approved by God. And it's like, well, I mean, but clearly not, because like the sex scandal, like that was clearly the most satanic thing I've ever seen. And the church bureaucracy tried to cover it up. How am I supposed to trust in that if it is then telling me deny humans the right to
I
exist?
learned something really interesting talking with the Insurance Federation in Pennsylvania.
Okay, tell me
about that. Just like a weird aside, that a change of the statute of limitation around that was inspired by Catholic Church abuse of children affects the insurance market in a way that would make insurance prohibitively expensive for childcare centers, to make it like almost impossible to open a childcare business in our state.
Oh,
isn't
that's
it funny?
Very interesting.
Yeah, like from the you have to be careful about the legislative changes that you make when you're regulating people perspective, and less is more in many cases. That's one of those really interesting knock-on effect things. Anyway, something I learned recently, I thought was interesting.
Well, I mean, I think this shows how much child sex abuse happens in daycare centers, and this is something that we need to.
Well, no. You are legally required to be insured for that when you open a daycare center.
Yeah, but I mean that they expect this to be violated, and then people to remember it as adults. Like, that to me shows that this must be happening pretty frequently.
It's more that some person, when deciding the regulatory requirements of a daycare center.
Simone, that's not the point I'm making. The insurance wouldn't cost much if this never happened. It costs a lot because it's a frequent occurrence. You understand that, right?
Right, but then I think the issue is that they're not striating the form of liability enough, where maybe you should have like a religious one, and then a daycare one, and a public school one, and separate out the actuary tables differently.
No, what it shows is that the type of abuse that happened within the Catholic Church is actually common among all industries where people are around kids.
Yeah.
But it shouldn't have been happening in the church at all. And what it shows to me as an outsider, that I can't just take the church bureaucracy and
I don't know. I mean, of all places where you'd expect it to happen, the Catholic Church just seems so logical, because I always see Catholicism as, you can mess up. You just have to feel bad about it and ask, and confess and repent.
Well, no, not easy, because like if you look at the cadaver synod, we've talked about it before, which is
the trial
and stuff. Yeah. It's not even like, well, the Pope is protected from making mistakes. Like, I don't know. To me, they're like, no, it's in these very special instances that the Pope is protected from making mistakes. And it's like, yeah, but those instances weren't codified until after the Cadaver Synod. So they weren't relevant in the Cadaver Synod. And your average Catholic would have believed that all of that was biblically inspired. You can't like make the rules that make that not relevant after that happens. And I would also note, which a lot of people forget, is the Cadaver Synod happened sort of right before the split of the Orthodox Church from the Catholic Church. And so they would have had that fresh in their minds during the split when the Catholics were like, actually, we should be in charge of everything and our bureaucracy gets everything right always. They would have been like, but
what about that dead guy you put on trial?
Dead Pope you put on trial.
Well,
and then one Pope then said, not just condemned him afterwards, because you couldn't be like, well, that Pope really was a bad guy. But then the Pope after that then said, no, actually everything was cool. And the guy who condemned him was the bad guy. So you had
I wonder if they changed his
splits.
outfit. Did they dress him for trial, or did they just have him wear whatever he was wearing in the grave? Imagine being that guy who's like been tasked with preparing him for trial. That'd be very awkward. Anyway, we're splitting dead people's hairs now. I love you. And what do you want for dinner? Speaking of putting corpses on trial.
What do you have for cooking tonight? I'd be up for pasta, or I'd be up for the new pizza I got.
Or pot stickers. That's always an option.
Oh,
so the audience doesn't like that because all these things are carb heavy. Our audience seems to not believe in.
Let's actually do pot stickers. I love pot stickers tonight. You've done a great job with those recently. Can I do pot stickers and then a side of that soup that I got? The
new one?
The new one, yeah. What was it? Like sweet potato soup?
Good heavens, I don't know, but we can do it. Wait. Off we go.
I love you.
I love you too. Oh, wait to go to Stacy and John, because we're together. We can walk over some groceries for them. Okay.
You want to? I can walk over the groceries by myself.
Yeah, but I need to pack them. So just let me come down. Okay.
Okay, fine.
Love you.
And I understand why, despite the Bible saying that, he knows you before you were conceived in your mother's womb, and that means that there's a lot of weight to decisions, because if life begins before conception, then you are responsible for every human that you have decided to not bring into this world, if you had the ability to do that. And so I understand why people have chosen to not take responsibility for this interpretation. But if it's accurate, it's pretty horrifying. It means that this Mormon interpretation of what's heaven like, well, I don't think it's exactly like that, all of the kids waiting to be born. I do think it can be useful to envision our future kids like this, because it helps us make better moral choices around them, in the same way that, I often imagine if one of my kids thought about becoming a celibate priest of whatever denomination, that their children would be up in heaven just like horrified, yelling at them, what are you doing? Read the Bible.
Emily, what's wrong?
I'm the last kid to be born. What if by that time Mom and Dad don't want me?
No way.
But I've seen lots of families make promises and then break them.
Not us.
Emily, I will see to it personally that you're not forgotten.
You promise, Jimmy?
Promise.
We need 1,000,000 subscribers.
We do? Is that what you said you wanted this morning?
Yeah.
Why did you say you wanted that this morning?
Because I just wanted to.
And then you told me the subscribers are people.
Yeah.
And why do they watch you?
Because. And you know why? Because that's great.
Do you want them to like you?
Yes.
What are you doing? What?
You're tricky.
You're being tricky?
Yeah. That's correct. Prince. And you gotta come to our house because the 1,000,000 subscribers gotta come.
I think that'd be very, very bad. But wouldn't that be too many people? Wouldn't you get scared?
Yeah, well, I will not be scared.
Not even a little?
No.
What, are subscribers friends?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I love you.
I do like this describe in friends. Okay?
Okay, say bye-bye.
Bye-bye.